It started with a closed-door conversation deep inside Balmoral Castle, far from the cameras and carefully scripted smiles that usually protect the royal family from scandal. But when Prince William reportedly emerged from that private meeting, visibly tense and unwilling to address waiting aides, even longtime palace staff sensed something had shifted. What began as quiet speculation about a property arrangement involving Prince Andrew's family quickly escalated into a confrontation powerful insiders now describe as one of the most explosive disputes between William and King Charles since the coronation. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, palace officials reportedly tried to dismiss the situation as a routine family matter, the kind of internal arrangement that never reaches public attention. But behind those guarded responses, tension was already spreading through royal corridors. William, according to insiders, had only recently discovered the full extent of the Balmoral residential discussions involving Andrew's family, and the revelation struck a nerve that those closest to him had not seen in years. The Prince of Wales had spent much of the past several years carefully shaping an image of a monarchy moving toward transparency, discipline, and modern accountability. To him, Balmoral was never just another estate hidden among the Scottish hills. It carried emotional weight, historical weight, symbolic weight, and the idea that it could quietly become entangled in another controversy tied to Prince Andrew reportedly felt like a direct threat to everything William believed the monarchy needed to become. What made the situation even more explosive was the growing belief that senior aides had attempted to soften the seriousness of the arrangement before William learned about it himself. That detail, more than anything else, allegedly intensified the confrontation behind palace walls. Sources close to the institution described an atmosphere of distrust beginning to form between different royal households, with some aides trying desperately to prevent the disagreement from becoming personal between father and son. But by then, emotions were already taking control. William reportedly questioned how such a sensitive decision could move forward without considering the public consequences that would inevitably follow once details surfaced. For a future king already battling concerns over public confidence in the monarchy, the optics alone were dangerous. The royal family had spent years trying to distance itself from scandals connected to Andrew, yet suddenly there were whispers suggesting old loyalties were quietly re-emerging behind closed doors. Inside royal circles, Balmoral itself became the emotional centre of the argument. Palace insiders allegedly described the estate as a sacred royal sanctuary, a place deeply tied to the late Queen's memory and protected traditions stretching back generations. To William, according to reports, that symbolism mattered enormously. Balmoral represented continuity, dignity, and restraint. Allowing controversy to touch that legacy reportedly felt reckless to him, especially at a time when the monarchy was already navigating public skepticism, generational pressure, and growing calls for reform. But for King Charles, the issue may have looked very different. Those close to the monarch reportedly viewed the matter through the complicated lens of family loyalty, personal responsibility, and long-standing private commitments that existed long before William's vision of modernization took center stage. And that difference in perspective is where the fracture reportedly deepened. What began as frustration soon evolved into something far more emotional. Observers inside the palace described exchanges that grew increasingly tense, with William allegedly refusing to back down as concerns about the monarchy's reputation intensified. The future king reportedly believed every private decision now carried enormous public consequences in a media climate where secrecy rarely survives for long. And beneath the disagreement over Balmoral was a deeper, more painful question neither side could easily escape. What kind of monarchy would survive the next generation? One guided by old protections and private understandings, or one willing to make brutal decisions in order to preserve public trust? That question reportedly lingered long after the meeting ended, because as palace insiders would later admit in hushed conversations, the confrontation at Balmoral was never truly about property alone. It was about power, legacy, and a growing divide between two future visions of the crown that may no longer be compatible at all. For years, palace officials tried to convince the public that Prince Andrew's role inside royal life had quietly faded into history. Yet, according to various royal insiders, the Duke's lingering presence inside the private ecosystem of Balmoral never fully disappeared. Behind the mist-covered Scottish hills and carefully guarded gates, whispers reportedly continued about special accommodations, protected privileges, and an invisible effort to preserve fragments of Andrew's former status despite the monarchy's public distancing campaign. The deeper royal aides looked into the situation, the more complicated the picture allegedly became. Publicly, the monarchy had worked relentlessly to project an image of separation, discipline, and accountability. Statements were carefully crafted, appearances were reduced, distances were emphasized. But privately, according to insiders familiar with internal family tensions, the emotional reality inside royal circles was far less straightforward. Andrew was not merely a disgraced public figure to those who had spent decades alongside him behind palace walls. He was still a brother, still a son, still part of a deeply intertwined institution built on blood ties that rarely break cleanly, even under enormous public pressure. And nowhere did those unresolved loyalties reportedly remain more visible than at Balmoral. For King Charles, sources claim the burden of family responsibility never fully disappeared. Those close to the monarch allegedly believed he carried a private sense of duty toward Andrew that extended far beyond headlines and public outrage. While officials focused on protecting the crown's reputation, Charles reportedly faced a deeply personal struggle between institutional survival and family loyalty. That internal conflict became increasingly difficult to hide as questions surrounding Balmoral quietly resurfaced. Because Balmoral was never viewed as ordinary royal property, inside palace culture, it represented continuity itself. Tradition, legacy, the emotional heart of royal identity passed down across generations. And according to insiders, maintaining Andrew's connection to that world became symbolic of a much larger divide unfolding behind closed doors. Prince William reportedly saw the situation through an entirely different lens. To him, every lingering protection surrounding Andrew allegedly carried enormous political danger. The future king had spent years trying to modernize the monarchy's public image at a time when public trust had become increasingly fragile. Younger generations were already questioning the institution's relevance, its finances, and its accountability. Palace strategists reportedly warned that even the appearance of hidden privileges tied to Andrew could ignite another devastating backlash. The fear was not simply about scandal anymore. It was about credibility, about whether the monarchy could continue asking for public respect while appearing unable to fully separate itself from controversies the public believed should have ended long ago. That tension reportedly triggered growing anxiety inside Kensington Palace. Advisors close to William allegedly feared that old royal instincts were beginning to overpower the modernization strategy carefully built since the late Queen's final years. Some insiders described an emerging split between two competing visions of survival. One side believed the monarchy's strength came from unwavering loyalty to family, even during disgrace and scandal. The other believed survival now depended on ruthless accountability and a willingness to sacrifice old protections in order to preserve institutional legitimacy. Neither side was prepared to fully surrender. And as discussions surrounding Balmoral continued behind closed doors, those ideological divisions reportedly became impossible to ignore. What made the situation even more volatile was the growing realization that the public might never fully understand how much influence these private loyalties still carried within royal decision-making. Officials allegedly worried that renewed scrutiny over Balmoral arrangements could reopen painful questions the palace had desperately tried to bury. Questions about privilege, about fairness, about whether the monarchy truly operated under the modern standards it publicly promoted. And as William uncovered how deeply these old loyalties still influenced royal decisions, frustration inside Kensington Palace reportedly turned into outright alarm. According to palace administrative whispers circulating through both Kensington Palace and Clarence House, the true breaking point came during a tense private exchange where William allegedly questioned why Andrew's family continued receiving consideration tied to one of the monarchy's most protected estates. Witnesses reportedly described the future king as unusually direct, abandoning his normal diplomatic restraint as concerns over public trust, royal discipline, and institutional credibility suddenly collided in one devastating moment. For those inside royal circles, the intensity of the confrontation reportedly felt deeply unsettling because William was known for caution. He rarely allowed emotion to override control, especially during sensitive family matters. But insiders claim something about the Balmoral situation struck a far deeper nerve than previous palace disagreements. The future king allegedly believed the monarchy had reached a dangerous crossroads where even small private decisions could trigger enormous public consequences. Years of scandal, public frustration, and declining institutional trust had already weakened the crown's protective shield. William reportedly feared that continuing to offer special consideration connected to Andrew would send what he described as mixed signals to a public already questioning whether accountability inside the monarchy truly existed at all. According to sources familiar with the private discussions, William allegedly warned that the royal family could not afford to repeat mistakes that had nearly destroyed public confidence in previous decades. That warning reportedly carried enormous emotional weight because it reflected more than frustration over one arrangement. It reflected a growing fear that the institution was slipping backward into old survival instincts built on secrecy, protection, and internal loyalty over public responsibility. Insiders claim William spoke bluntly about how younger generations viewed the monarchy differently now. Public patience was thinner. Sympathy was harder to regain, and any appearance of hidden privilege tied to controversial figures could become catastrophic almost overnight. For William, this was no longer simply about family compassion. It was about survival. But while William reportedly pushed for harder lines and clearer accountability, King Charles allegedly appeared emotionally cornered by the entire situation. Those close to the monarch described him as exhausted, overwhelmed by the impossible balance between personal loyalty and royal duty. Charles had spent decades preparing to lead the monarchy through a modern era. Yet suddenly he found himself trapped between the expectations of the institution and the emotional weight of family bonds that could not easily be erased. Insiders claim the king grew increasingly isolated during this period, relying on a shrinking circle of trusted aides, while tensions between royal households quietly intensified behind palace walls. Senior courtiers reportedly recognized the danger immediately. What frightened them most was not simply the disagreement itself, but what it revealed about the widening divide between Charles and William's approaches to leadership. One side still believed the monarchy's strength came from preserving family unity wherever possible, even under immense public pressure. The other believed survival now depended on absolute clarity, ruthless discipline, and visible accountability. That ideological clash allegedly turned private discussions into emotional battlegrounds where every decision carried symbolic meaning far beyond Balmoral alone. Courtiers reportedly scrambled to contain the fallout before frustration hardened into lasting resentment between father and son. And beneath the surface of the confrontation was another painful truth few inside the palace were willing to say openly. William was no longer thinking only as a son defending the institution. He was thinking like a future king preparing for a reign that would inherit every unresolved scandal left behind by previous generations. That realization reportedly changed the tone of the exchange entirely. Because once the argument shifted from private loyalty to institutional survival, compromise became far more difficult to reach. The emotional distance between Charles and William allegedly widened with every conversation, while aides feared the monarchy itself was being pulled into a quiet internal fracture the public was never meant to witness. But while insiders focused on the emotional confrontation itself, Another revelation was quietly emerging, one that threatened to make the entire situation even more damaging. It was not merely the possibility of Andrew's family remaining connected to Balmoral that unsettled royal observers, it was the nature of the arrangement itself. Reports suggest William became increasingly concerned that any long-term residential understanding tied to the estate could be interpreted as a silent rehabilitation effort. One carried out while the monarchy was already battling declining trust, financial scrutiny and growing pressure to justify every royal privilege still protected behind palace gates. According to insiders familiar with private palace discussions, the issue quickly evolved far beyond property logistics or temporary accommodations. What reportedly alarmed William most was the symbolism hidden beneath the arrangement. In royal life, symbolism was everything. A single gesture could rewrite public perception overnight. A private invitation could become a public statement, and Balmoral carried emotional significance unlike almost any other royal estate. It was inseparable from the memory of Queen Elizabeth II, from decades of carefully protected tradition, from an image of stability the monarchy desperately needed during moments of national uncertainty. To quietly maintain extended access connected to Andrew's family in such a place reportedly felt, to William, like an extraordinary gamble with public trust. Royal commentators and palace strategists allegedly feared the consequences if details ever reached the public in full. The monarchy was already navigating dangerous territory. Questions about wealth, privilege, and taxpayer expectations had intensified in recent years, particularly among younger generations who viewed royal protections with increasing skepticism. Advisors reportedly warned that even if no formal rules had been broken, the public would not focus on legal technicalities. They would focus on appearances, on perception, on whether the monarchy truly understood the damage caused by previous scandals, or whether old habits of quiet protection still operated behind closed palace doors. That fear reportedly hung over every internal discussion surrounding Balmoral. William allegedly argued that the institution could no longer afford decisions shaped solely by private emotion or family history. Sources claim he believed public confidence had become dangerously fragile, and once trust collapsed, rebuilding it could take decades. To him, Balmoral represented something sacred within the monarchy's emotional architecture. It symbolized dignity, restraint, and continuity carried through generations under Queen Elizabeth's careful stewardship. Any arrangement capable of creating suspicion around that legacy reportedly struck William as politically reckless. Insiders claim he repeatedly stressed that the monarchy's survival depended not only on what it did, but on what people believed it was willing to tolerate. But while William pushed for caution and stricter boundaries, others inside royal circles reportedly understood why King Charles hesitated to sever remaining connections completely. Some insiders claim the king feared another devastating family fracture at a time when the monarchy was already weakened by years of emotional division, public scandal, and personal loss. Charles had spent much of his life navigating painful ruptures inside the royal family, and according to those close to him, the idea of completely abandoning Andrew carried emotional consequences few outsiders fully understood. That internal struggle allegedly left the monarch trapped between institutional responsibility and private loyalty, unable to fully satisfy either side. As tensions quietly escalated, another dangerous problem reportedly emerged behind palace walls. Staff members allegedly grew increasingly fearful that sensitive details could leak from competing royal households. Different factions inside the institution were said to be protecting their own interests, their own narratives, and in some cases their own futures. That atmosphere of distrust reportedly created enormous anxiety among senior aides, desperate to avoid another public relations disaster. Because once suspicion entered palace corridors, secrecy became fragile. Conversations became guarded. Loyalties became uncertain. And every quiet disagreement carried the potential to explode into something far more destructive. The deeper the situation evolved, the clearer it became that Balmoral itself had transformed into a symbol of a monarchy struggling to define its future. Was the crown still guided by emotional loyalty to family above all else, or had survival in the modern era demanded something colder and far more unforgiving? That question reportedly haunted private discussions long after official meetings ended, while insiders watched tensions rise between father and son with growing alarm. And as palace anxiety intensified, attention slowly shifted toward the one figure caught painfully between loyalty to family and responsibility to the crown. Those familiar with the emotional strain surrounding King Charles say the monarch appeared increasingly trapped between two irreconcilable instincts: protecting a vulnerable brother while preserving the fragile credibility of the institution he spent his entire life preparing to inherit. Inside palace corridors already overshadowed by health concerns and succession anxieties, the Balmoral conflict reportedly became a painful symbol of Charles's wider struggle to balance compassion, legacy, and survival. According to insiders, private meetings between father and son grew more tense with each passing day, as William allegedly pushed a far harsher vision for the monarchy's future, one built not on emotional loyalty, but on discipline, distance, and public accountability. While Charles reportedly viewed the matter through the painful lens of family responsibility, William increasingly believed the institution itself could not survive another scandal tied to perceived royal protection. Courtiers quietly feared the growing divide would damage the image of unity the monarchy depended upon during an already fragile period. Comparisons reportedly began surfacing to Queen Elizabeth II's stricter handling of controversy, with some insiders suggesting William admired the late Queen's ability to place duty above personal feeling when the crown faced danger. That belief allegedly intensified after the Balmoral dispute, as Kensington Palace aides reportedly began accelerating long-term modernization plans designed to create firmer internal boundaries around controversial figures. Behind palace walls, discussions surrounding future public engagements, institutional reform, and tighter royal structures quietly gained momentum. Sources claim William emerged from the confrontation more decisive than ever, increasingly supported by figures like Princess Anne, whose reputation for discipline and duty aligned closely with his thinking. But beneath William's growing determination was another reality few inside the palace could ignore. Every step toward modernization carried an emotional cost. Challenging his father was not simply political, it was deeply personal. And as public patience for royal controversy reportedly continued shrinking, the monarchy's future image became the center of every internal conversation unfolding behind closed doors. Yet, despite William's growing resolve to reshape the institution around accountability and survival, palace insiders whispered that the emotional consequences of confronting King Charles so directly were only beginning to unfold. While the public continued seeing carefully managed appearances and disciplined royal messaging, insiders quietly claimed something fundamental had changed behind palace walls after the Balmoral dispute erupted internally. Relations between competing royal households reportedly grew colder with every passing week. As long-standing tensions hardened into silent rivalries no public statement could fully conceal. According to sources close to both Kensington Palace and Clarence House, aides increasingly divided into opposing camps, each carrying a very different vision for the monarchy's survival. William's supporters allegedly believed firmness was no longer optional. To them, public trust had become the crown's most fragile asset, and any hesitation surrounding accountability risked pushing the institution into irreversible decline. But loyalists surrounding King Charles reportedly feared something equally dangerous: that excessive rigidity could fracture the royal family permanently and transform the monarchy into an institution stripped of compassion, loyalty, and humanity. What began as a dispute over Andrew's lingering connection to Balmoral reportedly evolved into something much larger and far more unsettling. Balmoral itself became symbolic of the monarchy's wider succession-era anxieties. The estate no longer represented only royal tradition or private family refuge. Instead, insiders claim it became the emotional battleground between two competing futures for the House of Windsor. One future rooted in patience, reconciliation, and preserving family unity despite scandal. The other driven by ruthless modernization, tighter discipline, and the belief that survival now demanded sacrifice. As tensions quietly deepened, even experienced royal observers reportedly sensed unusual strain during subsequent appearances by senior royals. Smiles appeared more measured, interactions more restrained, conversations more guarded. Palace staff allegedly became increasingly fearful of leaks, knowing that trust between households had weakened in ways rarely seen during Charles's reign. By the time the dust finally began settling around Balmoral, one reality reportedly became impossible for senior royals to ignore. Prince William was no longer simply preparing to inherit the monarchy, he was already fighting to redefine it. According to insiders, the confrontation with Charles forced deeper fears surrounding legacy and succession directly into the open. William allegedly viewed accountability as the only path capable of protecting the monarchy from future collapse, while Charles still hoped private reconciliation could somehow preserve both the institution and the family holding it together. But palace observers increasingly believe the future reign of William may become significantly stricter, colder, and far less forgiving than anything seen in modern royal history. Because behind the silence of Balmoral's ancient stone walls, the monarchy may already be transforming into something entirely different from the institution Queen Elizabeth once fought so carefully to preserve. And as silence settled across palace corridors once more, insiders reportedly began asking the same unsettling question in whispers never meant to leave royal walls. Had this confrontation quietly changed the future of the crown forever? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.